Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining our panel discussion today. I'm Emma, and I'm on the marketing team here at SafePass, and I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel today for how to identify and remediate conflicts before your audit. If you have any questions, feel free to send those over in the panel. We'll get through to those at the end of the session if we have time today. So our goal today is to leave you with a fresh perspective, a new strategy that you can implement in your own organization so that you can be successful. So we'll start with some very brief introductions of our panelists today, followed by some brief introductions of the companies that are hosting the session today, SafePass and Searchlight Consulting based in the UK, and then we will dive right into the meat of the discussion, which is why you're all here today. So, Brian?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Thank you. So I'm Brian Oak, and I'm one of the directors of Searchlight Consulting. We'll tell a little bit more about Searchlight in a minute, but just from my own perspective, I've been involved in what I loosely or broadly called technology-enabled change programs, so ERP programs and other business applications and business process improvement programs now for getting on for 30 years, really. And so what I'd like to do in this is try and bring some perspective about the importance of segregation of duty and compliance and controls when we're going through those projects.
That's great. Thanks, Brian. And Scott?
Hey, hello, everyone. My name is Scott Eloquent. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer here at SafePass. And actually, in my prior life, I actually had run a national Oracle services firm, and we focus on e-business suite and ERP cloud and helping customers get more value out of the software they run. And I love that this offering and this approach really is uniquely suited to that specific purpose.
Fantastic stuff. And Adil?
Yes, hi, Adil Khan, CEO of SafePass. This is my area of expertise, so I'm glad to be able to share that with you folks. I spend a lot of time with customers in pre-audit or sometimes, unfortunately, post-audit when there's a lot of remediation to do. I've actually written a book based on my customer experiences over the last 20 years. Probably when we wrote the book, 2012, was 100 or so customers at that time. So those experiences are in a book called Governance, Risk, and Compliance Handbook for Oracle applications, but it's really applicable for any application and really any company. So that's my experience, is really helping customers identify risks, detect risks, and especially hidden risks that are hard to eyeball, that you'll see in this session today, and help them detect, prevent, and monitor the controls that mitigate that risk in their key business processes. Started off as a CEO of a public company, and then as Sarbanes-Oxley was signed by George Bush into law back in 2002, got into this area with advice from my external auditors at the time, Deloitte. And since then, we've been pretty much hands-on on helping customers with their internal control challenges with GRC control type capabilities that streamline, automates that. So thank you, everybody, for joining today.
Excellent. Thanks, Adil. And Brian, if you'd like to talk a little bit about Searchlight.
Yes. Thank you. So it's Searchlight Consulting, as Emma said, we're based in the UK, but we get involved in programs, international programs across the different industries, really. And if I look at this, the audience, I think, for this session is probably predominantly coming from either finance or risk compliance areas of the business. So what I've identified here are some of the things that we do for to help people that are in the chief CFO offices or the rest of it. So we're an independent business and technology change consultancy, helping medium to large size enterprises. And really, we're looking at trying to utilize technology to improve the way that the businesses work. And if you look at the things that we typically do with finance clients, then it is very much around this regulatory compliance side of things, making sure that controls and risk is managed and compliance is enforced. But then it could be also organizational alignment, just general application modernization, or process optimization, automation, but always with some sort of business outcome expected at the end of it. So whether that's working capital optimization or business spend management, whatever it might be, there's a number of different angles on it. And really our objective is to help clients make better decisions and reduce the risks from technology implementation, and make sure that they mitigate against risks, and they build into those processes and systems the things that they need to both run the business efficiently and effectively, but also to control it and manage the risks associated with it. So I'm really pleased to be here today.
Thanks, Brian. That's great. And a little bit about SafePass. We have heard a little bit, Adele, but if you'd like to elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, I think this is a good way to just kind of give you an idea of our thought leadership in the market. We've talked about, our interest in publishing books and papers. There's also medium like this webinar itself. Our goal is to get this knowledge about risk management out to the ERP community, specifically the Oracle community, which I've been a big part of over the last 20 years, participating in user groups and had the experience of publishing and presenting our research or lessons learned, if you will, from our customer base to the broader community of Oracle users and other ERP systems as well. So yeah, that's kind of our area of expertise, and it's broad enough to where it's not just US listed companies. Just so you know, we work on 5 continents. We have customers, and they seek the global best practices today, whether you're in Dallas, Texas, where I am, or Johannesburg, South Africa, where we have a great customer that leverages SafePass. So hopefully what you'll hear today, and I'm really excited to have Brian here from UK, is basically what has developed over the last 20 years as global best practices for pre-audits that is adopted by most major audit firms, including one of the Big 4 audit firms that uses SafePass to conduct audits.
Great. And what do we have here then, Scott?
All right, so as you saw on Adele's previous slide, I mean, SafePass is a software product that sits in the cloud, and it is Gartner recognized for segregation of duties as well as other things. And if you look across, I think, Emmy, you may have a little box that'll draw in here. There you go. So it does a lot of stuff: access controls, provisioning, role definition and design. We can enforce a lot of different things. We can do transaction monitoring as well as automating processes. But today we're going to focus on the pre-audit process and what you can do in advance. So if you look at the little green box, green being good, is that it's going to narrow down to some things very specific: segregation of duties, and really trying to define the things that you really need to focus on before the auditor comes. So just so you know that this is a broader picture, but we're going to focus on a very specific piece for the purposes of this webinar today.
Absolutely. So this is the agenda we'll be following this morning. Basically, how problems start, why address them, and how to get started. So remember to send across any questions you may have during the session. So Brian, you want to kick off?
Yes, yeah, I think it's worthwhile putting this in context. So we're focusing in very much on this segregation of duties aspect of risk and compliance and controls, but we need to recognise that sort of sits quite squarely sort of in the middle of a stack of everything from enterprise risk at a strategic level, all the other things people have to be, depending upon which industry you're in, about regulatory compliance. And then you get into the area where segregation of duties enforcement really comes into play around operational technology use, information security, and in particular, financial controls there. And I think, if people address risk and compliance and controls in a holistic fashion, then you start to get the benefits that are on the right-hand side. When you don't, then the consequences of not managing it properly can be quite severe. And I'll invite Scott or Adele to comment on some of the benefits and maybe some of the consequences of not managing this properly. Scott?
Well, it's funny, Brian, my eyes are naturally drawn to your slide on the left where it says jail sentences.
Yes.
I think sometimes we do focus on the boogeyman, I gotcha kind of thing. But I do think that we lose sight of the operational efficiencies. You know, you look at the system, and you know, Oracle's, you know, specifically it's a big batch system. There's a lot of staging tables. There's a lot of things you can do, and I think the thing that we don't realize is that, you know, one of the selling points of buying a big ERP system is you can configure it almost any way you want to do almost any business function that you want. But in the process, do you really know for sure how that thing is configured so that you can't do things that maybe were unintended, whether by accident? I mean, if you go through the tables and you look at the probably 30 to 50 people that have configured the software you're currently running, were they on the same page as you are today? You know, are you in a different business then than you are today? So getting a sense of where the holes are and where the gaps are and what the things that are naturally exist in those systems, I think have as much to do with the bottom line as it does with, you know, keeping you out of jail and getting you a good lawyer.
Yeah. Adil, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, Brian, I really like, it's a busy slide. What I like about this is that it tells the full story, right? So if you're a customer or one of our partners looking to create a business justification for segregation of duties, which is where this webinar can be helpful to you. So keeping that in mind, what I would say that I think you're seeing the risks in the red and the benefits on the right. That's pretty clear. But what we can back this up with, it's tons of case studies that can I talk for really literally hours to you about what's going on. But I think just to kind of give you some share my experiences, which is I'm here to do, is all those things on the right I have seen in my own practice and working with our partners like Brian, is that, you know, we can really identify those risks that are hard to capture, because all our customers that run ERP have already shown that they're interested in having really good business processes. And as Scott said, they're all configurable and so forth. So you've made the first good decision. The challenge you have is that whether you're a cloud ERP customer coming from an on-premise or you're staying on-premise, the challenge you have is those technologies are not designed for controls and risk management. Those ERP systems are designed to improve your business performance by helping you execute integrated business operations, right? To integrate all your, you know, payables with your purchasing, with your, you know, shipping and receiving, with your ultimately your customer. So all of these processes have risks, and your ERP system is designed to be configured to avoid those. But what customers run into with us many times is you know, why are we still seeing fraud? Why are we still seeing losses? Why are we still seeing waste? And the answer is that you need those controls in your ERPs to be monitored, starting with segregation of duties, which is the #1 most audited control these days when companies are concerned about financial misstatement risk. Because if I can create a supplier and pay a supplier, whether it's an error, a mistake, or a fraud, or just some training issue, it ultimately results in a misstatement, which can cause significant pressure on executives, not to mention IT folks that actually maintain these systems, and the company and stakeholders. So I just want to talk a little bit about benefits here, because I think if you could get something out of this webinar around justification to move forward with this type of initiative, I think you'll find it really easy to do working with Brian and Scott and others on our side, where we can help you not only show you where you can justify having a segregation of duty solution, but also back it up with chances are someone in your industry that has gone through the same thing before you, whether it's cloud or on-premise, doesn't matter.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so let's let's dig on now, Emma, and have a look at, you know, why we get problems in the first place, I guess. And I've laid out here a typical life cycle for an ERP program, moving through from mobilization through to deployment, and just highlighted. And as you can see, and again, you know, there's probably more that you could highlight, but just to keep it relatively simple. If we look at where things, you know, where the problems creep in, and it starts right at the very beginning, because it starts by, I mean, as Adil said, you know, these systems are configured to execute processes, and typically what we're looking to do is trying to improve on the processes that we have today. And in the process of doing that, we might well not place the sufficient emphasis from an executive perspective on what the control objectives are at the same time. So it starts right from that beginning when you're setting out, what's the program about and what's it trying to achieve. It's important that there is some aspect of that which is related to the overall controls discipline, the compliance framework that you have with and risk management that you have within an organization. And then that then extends into that design phase where individual work streams designing individual processes, they worry about how to execute the transaction and don't necessarily build into their thinking the fact that there needs to be compliance or controls points put into the process when they're designing it. And similarly, that whole bit about it's easy to map a process flow. It's important that you map that process flow against the organizational design so that you can start to identify the roles that are performing particular things, and then you can enforce those control disciplines. Pause there and let the guys chip in at all on that first bit of where these problems creep in.
Yeah, so as a partner of folks like yourself, Brian, where we paratroop in is when you're in that design phase of a project. And the experience I have working with some of your folks is that when you're laying out a good partner for an ERP customer is one that thinks about all those objectives, the control objectives, and doesn't wait till the deployment phase to then find out. So I think what you're really emphasizing here is a proactive approach in my mind.
Yeah.
And those partners that take a proactive approach, usually we find have much better success in delivering results to their customers, because all those questions that are going to come up in what we call user acceptance testing, but that's when your auditors come in, your executives come in, and that's too late. I mean, if you haven't thought through these things, now you got to go back and retrofit the controls. I mean, I can assure you your project's going to be over budget, and there's going to be some very unhappy people because retrofitting is a very expensive task. So I know it's one of those things that unfortunately slips sometimes at the design stage. And I've seen many, unfortunately, I've seen projects that have failed as a result of that too, where people just said, we're not going to go live with a system we can't trust to report financial results. And you don't want to get to that point, whether you're a partner or a customer listening to this. I think, the strategy that Brian's laying out, the approach that Searchlight uses really helps protect companies' investment in these very, very large, complex projects that companies undertake once in a decade or less, less often. So since you're using your initiative, this is really important.
Yeah, and I think even if you get the design bit right, there's then the opportunity in the middle where you get into building and you get into testing, and typically you're busy configuring the process, and of course the role profiles are things that overlay on that process, and the building and the definition of those role profiles tends to slip towards the end of the build phase, and then compounded within that is this whole business about, well, actually, who signs off the design of those profiles? Making sure you've got owners for all the different roles and responsibilities within that, and then the final bit is the testing bit, which is that you're pressurized during the testing phase, and you test the basic process flow, or you test the way in which the process operates, but you don't always get the opportunity to test the overlay of the roles on top of that. And then as you get closer to a go live stage, then you're in the position where actually now you've got to start allocating roles to people. And if you haven't done your organization design early enough, then matching the roles to the people to create profiles that are particular for that individual based on what they do in their job, then that also starts to incur or get squeezed and pushed further down the line. So going through that, even if you do the design properly, then the build, the test, the acceptance testing, and then the final thing that we see before we get into the deploy phase is where actually at the point of go live, we have seen clients that are then, even though they might have put some work into that, they're then opened up the profiles because they don't want to have challenges. They don't want to have people not being able to transact on day one. And so they don't strictly enforce the profiles that they want. And then, what happens then is people forget. People forget that Marion Accounts has not got, isn't an open profile, and it never gets shut down. So Scott, you want to chip in on that?
Well, most of my customers deal with this. It's not, if you look at the orange boxes and you go, oh my gosh, that's where we are. It's like, guess what? You have a lot of company out there, because the bottom line is projects are hard, budgets are tight, employees are working 2 jobs. And if you're doing a new implementation, if you don't, I think Adil used the word being proactive or prescriptive. It's like, if you don't design that in up front, it's really hard to kind of roll it in later. It's got to be kind of imbued into the structure and into the way you think. And if not, well, if I'm the finance director, I'm worried about finance controls. And if I'm the operations director, I'm worried about operations controls. But who's looking at the enterprise? If it's not really baked in up front, it's something that you really need to be very sensitive to down the road, because it's going to create a lot of additional work for auditors, a lot of findings on that side, a lot of things you have to deal with. So I guess I would say that if you are struggling with some of these things, if nothing else, you're in good company, because I think the vast majority of companies that I've worked with have these issues.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that even if you get it all spot on at the point when you're ready to go live, the next thing is that unless you've got good processes in place to make sure that you keep the practices going, and there's a way of approving how roles get assigned or how roles get changed and updated, then you need to have that discipline in place. And it's a bit like I always think of these things as a bit like going to the gym or something, isn't it? Yeah, you need somebody in the organization who is constantly on it and constantly making sure that the process is being followed, the procedures are being practiced, and that includes also when you get leavers, joiners, and movers, of course, because if someone changes a role and you don't sort of rescind the authorizations that they had before and then give them a new set, oftentimes what happens is that it just goes on and you get added to, and it gets added to, and it can so easily get out of control if you're not careful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us on to our next slide here. So Adil, do you want to take the lead on this one here?
Yeah, so I think this is a great slide for me to sort of talk through 2 different models, and I'll try to be brief, but there's actually a paper I presented when Oracle Cloud first was introduced by Oracle. It was a Fusion product back then, and one of my colleagues, Nigel King, was responsible for building the security model for the cloud. So he came to me and said, we're really looking to educate the market about, what the cloud is going to look like and how we move our ERP on-premise customers to this new model. And I was in conversation with many customers back, 5 years ago now, that were considering moving to the cloud. Now it's, a no-brainer for most of our customers that want to be in the cloud. The questions were coming up that I was just surprised to hear, that the security models, people assumed that they were going to be very similar. So cloud is a RBAC model, whereas the customized model that EBS uses is fairly, old, I guess is a word. It was developed, Scott and I were talking maybe in the 80s or 90s. So it's fairly complex and old, but if you've gone through a process of doing all this hard work and you've paid consultants and auditors, in some cases I've seen customers spend millions of dollars on getting the security right, especially if they haven't done it in the beginning of the project, which many didn't with EBS, because it was, they've been using EBS for 20 plus years, and it was prior to even the Sarbanes-Oxley here in the US. So the security model, you've gone through that remediation process and you invested a lot of time in it, and now you want to move over to a security model that is more RBAC centric. So the 2 security models, if you're looking to the left of your slide, you'll see in Oracle eBusiness Suite, it's users that have 1 or more responsibilities, that have 1 or more menus and submenus, functions and subfunctions, and then forms. So that's the security model that you're trying to protect yourself against. And just in case of in case of e-business suite, because that's a mature product, much more mature than cloud. I think the numbers actually gone up, Emma, than what I have here. Last time I checked, and we have data from 200 some customers, so we do some aggregating and best practices off the actual data. So I've seen like 40,000 is a very common number for our customers. They have 40,000 plus functions that they need to analyze in order to protect against access risks, including segregation of duties. So clearly not any customer that I've run into uses everything that Oracle has put out there, which is hundreds of modules on this more mature platform. However, when they do run into these issues, we do need to analyze all that. And as you might imagine, you can't just look at a user like Scott and Brian and say, oh, I can eyeball how many functions they would have, and then I can, based on that eyeballing, I can determine if they should have access or not have access. It's nearly an impossible task. So our mature customers that are staying on eBusiness Suite, we find that they bring in outside help. They sometimes spend millions of dollars, and then they lose that useful value, leaves with those consultants and outside help. So even in-house, you have a turnover. So many of my calls that come in for help are, hey, we had all this settled down and now we've lost a few people, or we've changed the company, added a new module, and we're back to ground zero. Can you come in and help us automate that? So where SafePass can help you here, along with our partners like Brian, for if you're an on-premise customer, is to kind of quickly analyze that. And we have some health checks and so forth that Scott and Emma can tell you more about, which will, within a few days of time, analyze all of that risk and give you a nice, pretty report that you can take to your management and your, as part of your pre-audit, if you will. So you're not caught off guard when your auditors produce those results, and that goes straight to your audit committee. So unfortunately, this happened more often than I'd like to think, but it's essentially one of the things that a pattern I see in the industry constantly, where people have changes in their people, process, technology, and it ends up becoming a crisis that we're asked to help paratroop in and solve. And we can do that, but we'd rather work with you when you have more time to plan and do things right, because reactive work, in my mind, doesn't generate the best value for our customers. So engage with us, run some of these tests, work with Brian's team to test out some of the current controls you have. Whether you're a public company or a private company, it doesn't matter. Good controls are good business. So that's basically I wanted to talk about. Now, Brian touched on something that's really, we're seeing a lot more on the bottom screen, which is that cloud customer. Cloud customer, generally a new customer, either they're moving from Oracle, in which case we have, like I said, this white paper that kind of gives you an idea on how you can retain some of that investment you've made in building good controls in your on-premise EBS. But also, let's say you're coming off completely something different, like SAP or something. So you're just starting off this project. One of the things where we can help you as part of your pre-audit, back to that planning thing that we talked about, is to help you look at those seeded roles that are full of those profile problems that Brian was talking about. So, if you are a cloud ERP customer, you know this, that when you look at the GL role, GL can enter and post. They can maybe even do some subledger stuff, which is a big no-no in financial misstatement. Same thing with the procurement responsibilities. The purchasing manager can do approve purchase orders, create purchase orders, release invoices. So, those are the kind of things we're seeing on a daily basis from our cloud customers that are reporting these issues. And then you have, on top of that, this quarterly patching issue. So you have a continuous change management control on top of all this. So whether you're starting with the project or you've been live with cloud ERP for the last few years, we see both of those cases. Customers are really struggling with that profile that Brian talked about. And what we do to help those customers is through our roles manager, which is a tool we have specially created for customers that are dealing with that problem. A customer comes to mind as you guys were talking, which is one of the world's, I think, the largest rental car company, global rental car company, and they brought in a #1 global, probably a #1 computer company to help them do that. And they were struggling with this problem, and it's probably a few years old, so not something just today, but they were just churning, and the project was going over budget because they just couldn't get their roles right. So they called us up, and we trained them on Roles Manager, did some services around it, and they were able to save $200,000, recover $200,000 in costs. And that's one of the paper we have presented at Open World and probably is on our website as well. So those are the kind of real world examples where you start off that project that Brian had on the previous slide, you run into a problem, and now you got to do remediation, right? So you can take advantage of templates we have built for those specific roles in the past. You can use our technology and tools to be able to refine those and simulate them, right, before you touch your ERP system. So you can say, okay, what if I gave GL Manager the ability to reverse journal entries and create invoices? That's a liability because now they can hide that liability, and that's a segregation of duty violation. So those are the types of simulations you'll be able to do on SafePass, which will make sure that before your auditors get in, your environment is already clean as it can be. And things that are not clean, you can have a good explanation, because your IT folks need access. You have compensating controls. All of that work can be done, and it'll save you 10x in your substantive testing.
Yep. So let me just stop you there. So we did want to ask our attendees, a few questions. So how many of you can confidently answer the following questions? So now, Adil, we are at half past. So if you can be brief on the next slide, then that would be great.
Okay, so is this time checking? Is it a 45-minute or a 1 hour?
45 minutes.
Okay, so we got 15 minutes left. Gotcha. Okay, well, this is a very busy slide. I call it my marathon slide. It's got a lot to cover. So I'll try to cover it as quickly as I can, but it is an important slide because the journey of risk management starts by asking some basic questions, and that leads to additional questions. And that may be the way your auditors are asking you the questions. So I've kind of put this together with help of our team on what I've learned from our customers and how this problem sort of emerges. So it's usually a latent pain that somebody just in the organization asks the question, very basic, innocent question, and almost like what Brian said earlier, right? That do our ERP roles meet the requirements that our users have? Well, it sounds like a very innocent question, but the answer is not so simple because, well, what are the job roles? What are the job roles people have? Are those job roles set up in your HR system correctly? Have you reconciled your HR roles that you're hiring people against and holding them accountable against your roles that are configured and the privileges you've granted those users to do their jobs in the ERP system? Because we're expecting everything to be digital now, right? The whole world is going digital, software is eating everything. So we want to make sure that all our work is getting digital. So now these users are not doing some things in spreadsheets, some things through emails and voice. They're doing everything in the system. So are these job roles? And that'll become a much more complex question to answer. So if you're a customer, you're thinking about this, if you're a user of an ERP system or decision maker, that's your first question really. Is it working for me? And you're not even thinking about segregation of duties or audits. You're just thinking about productivity. Are people able to do everything they can? Well, it turns out that many times when I ask that question, and our customers ask that question, it turns out people aren't doing all their jobs in the ERP, even though that's what we're paying the big bucks for. They're still using spreadsheets and manipulating data to generate financial statements. Spreadsheets are 90% error prone, and they're causing this error. So there's a whole field in audit that has emerged or has been around for some time now. It's called spreadsheet audits, right? People are dedicating, tons of hours, depending on the company size, on just auditing the spreadsheets because the roles in the ERP don't give people the right access to do their job. So forget audit, you're just talking productivity at this stage. And I find joking with someone yesterday, I said, one of the common things that I see auditors do, and I used to do this, decades ago, you go to your IT guy, gal, and say, give me a list of all the active users. And you grab that list and you go to the next department in HR and you say, give me a list of all the active employees. And you look at the two lists. Well, there's 97 employees that are active and there's 100 users that are active. Well, what happened to 3 users? Well, that's an audit finding, right? I get my bonus for the day. I've done my job. I found a problem. It's the easiest thing to find because the two are impossible to stay in sync. Even with the modern cloud architecture, our customers are still reporting those issues. I have a call after this to really deal with a global company that has having the exact same issue right now.
Well, and Adil, I think the thing that's interesting, since I was the guy you were having that discussion with, I have a friend who had that exact situation that popped up. If you look at these 9 boxes on the chart, I mean, obviously we don't have time to cover the ins and outs of every single one, but I mean, in your heart of hearts, you as the user, you as the person that owns the system has to go through each box one by one and say, can you answer those questions? Because those are the questions that are going to be asked you when the audit hits. And so being prepared for that, I mean, how on earth would you prepare for that? Well, that's really part of what this discussion is about, to help you get the information you need to actually be able to answer some of these questions.
Yeah, so if you take this, so Scott, thanks for kind of putting that perspective on it. So yeah, it's really the questions are meant for you to answer in your organization, and I'm here to help just kind of give you some ideas. So I'll just kind of wrap up by saying that once you understand the roles and users, right, that the rest of this becomes a little bit easier for you, because then you can start asking questions. Well, if these roles are correct, what are we doing to enforce that, to maintain that, enforce that policies and procedures around those roles? Who gets access to financials? Who gets access to procurement in Singapore versus London? Those kind of questions you can start asking. And if you can't answer them, then Brian and his team can help you assess that, identify where the gaps are, and help you close those gaps. Same thing with super user activities. I won't have time to go through all of them with Emma's clock running here, but just think about those questions around who can access what, and then segregation of duties may be the 5th or 6th question you might have, but that's definitely part of running a good business, right? You're asking these questions: are people productive? Do we have good controls around the work they're doing to make sure they're not making mistakes, they're not causing waste and errors, or eventually even fraud? And then the last columns, those last 3 questions, I don't want to leave you without that, because what I find is a lot of people will stop on that, like the second row at the second column at the bottom, right? Are we verifying user access? So these are some very obvious questions, but what they get stuck with, and where segregation of duty really gets out of control, is you answer all those questions and you find that, oops, we still have people that are not that are doing things that are not following segregation of duty controls, and they still need access. Guess who those are? Those are folks like Brian, because they're helping you implement the software, or he's managing your software for you through managed services. So what do we do about those people? Well, that's where SafePass really comes in. That last leg there is where SafePass has some unique value proposition beyond segregation of duties. Because people basically run that segregation of duties, they clean up their system, and then find they can only get to 60% or 70% of what they need done. The rest is what we call compensating control in our lingo, right? So that's about maintaining an audit trail on when configurations change. So Brian's team goes in, he's doing your managed services, and changes the approval hierarchy on who can approve a journal entry over 5 million. And then changes it back. One of the people that are working for him does that. So you want to be able to create that audit trail on configurations. You want to be able to see who changes supplier bank accounts and credit limits on customers. You want to be able to see terminated employees. So all of that last leg is where you will see that many other reporting tools will drop off, and SafePass will take you all the way to a complete solution.
Excellent. So why perform a health check then, Scott?
Well, it's funny. You look at the slide. Wow, discover strengths and weaknesses, identify security control risks, blah, blah, blah. These are all really helpful things. And I won't read the slide to you. But the bottom line is someone's going to walk in your office in a day, in a week, in a month, and they're going to say, here's what we found. And so to me, the goal is to look inside your system, to look at the things that the auditors are going to be looking at to help you prepare. And if you were taking a standardized test and you could practice in advance, you would want to do that. You would want to know what the answers are. You would want to know what the findings are, so that if, hey, why does Bob have access to these 2 things? It's like, well, maybe there's a good reason for it. I'm going to prepare for that. I'm going to get my notes together. I'm going to document that it was approved. I'm going to find the file wherever it's stored. I'm going to make sure it's organized so the auditors can get to it, so that we have a good finding. And honestly, I'd rather look at this report in the quiet of my office than have my boss's boss come in and drop it on my desk and ask me to explain why those things are there. So the goal is, and I look at it kind of like those little modules now that you can stick under the dash of your car and grab your phone and it'll tell you a bunch of stuff about what's going on inside your car. These are some things that will let you look inside your system to understand what's going on inside your system so you can know where your concerns should be, so you know where to focus your attention so you can be prepared when the audit comes. And on the next slide, there you go. So there really are three parts of this process. The first part is, we're going to go through and we have a controls catalog. We will look at literally 1,500, I think I saw 1,600 different controls. They're going to look at finite segregation of duty violations based on standards, based on years of experience that we've built up over time. But the bottom line is that handing you a report of, potentially thousands or even millions of violations isn't going to be very helpful. So the second thing that we do is we run it through called a pre-processor that evaluates those violations based on risk. What is the materiality? What is the frequency? What is the likelihood that those things are going to happen? So some things will get left out. Some things will show up because those are the things that are most important. And then the final thing, and again, this is all about preparing for the audit, is to look at exclusions, compensating controls, things that maybe the ERP system can't technically exclude, but you're managing and monitoring through a manual process, or you have programs in place, or it's something that, for whatever reason, maybe it's a super user where you've got a special project set up where you're auditing or controlling that separately, so that when you're done, you should get a report that says, here are the things that the auditors are going to focus on. These are the things that I need to prepare for to let you do your homework. And if you'll pull up the next slide, Emma, which has some of the more finite, there's a list of the reports that actually come in our health check. There definitely are other ways to do this, but if you look at some of those specific titles of some of those specific things, it's pretty clear what the reason is you should care about it. And maybe, I don't know, Brian, I'll invite you and Adil both to speak to any of the specific things that, for example, that you would do if you ended up with a finding in one of those areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the one that I would focus on is those which are, to do that are identified. So roles are one thing, jobs are something different. Yeah. So doing that analysis, it says you might have some role violations between different roles, but actually within your organization, there's no choice because you haven't got enough people to segregate all the duties in there. So you have to have other steps in place which may well be off system, and that's part of that being prepared, isn't it? Being able to explain and being able to then demonstrate what the other aspects of the controls are that you have around it. So that would be one of my first areas to look at, how the roles map to organization design, and whether that's valid or not. Adil, have you got a quick add on that?
Yeah, just to kind of add to that, Brian. So yeah, I can see from your perspective, because you're dealing with customers that are deploying a new system or bringing you in to make that change. I think roles are a great way to start, and that's something I guide our partners to do and our customers to do. If you're taking on a new initiative where you're designing new roles or upgrading the roles, looking at the roles, and I think it's called the responsibility report in EBS, and it's called the roles report in Oracle ERP, so we have a slightly different naming convention. So if you're, I would say run the roles report, because one of the people get confused about it during a project. I'm having a client right now that I'm working with here in my region that is saying, well, I don't have these roles assigned, so I can't really run your tool right now till I get it all the way down to assigning all the final users that are going to ultimately have access. And that's going to not happen until I go live. So let me just hold off on this whole thing. And that's a really misconception, because as Brian said, we can test the roles before they're even assigned to anyone. And that report is really helpful at the design stage. The design stage, you actually design what you want. So you say our financial folks will have these roles. And then when you build those, that's the time to actually test them, not wait till the UAT, right? So you could build those roles and test them in SafePass to make sure they comply with the policies you had implemented at the design phase of your project. On the other hand, if you're a mature e-business customer sitting on premise or some other ERP system, your problem is slightly different. You mostly care about the user reports. What are users doing and have been doing for the last 20 years? How many are still active? How many are, so it just depends where your perspective is, but we provide you a whole set of reports to cover whatever your objectives are. whether you're implementing a new ERP or you have a 20-year-old ERP you're trying to maintain and keep it clean.
Hey, Brian, I know we're trying to wrap up here. We're getting pretty close. Emma, did you want to go to the kind of the action item slide, the next slide, and let Brian lead that off real quickly?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess it comes back to, you know, Scott's argument is about being prepared, and I suppose this takes it to the next step that says, actually, you know, it's all very well being presented with information, but if you don't act on it, yeah, if you don't act and try and rectify it and remediate it, then it's really not going to be a very worthwhile exercise, because you'll just get hit with the same comments further down the line. So here's a little structure basically that just says, well, let's just make sure that as we look at these actions, that we put them in the context, that prioritization, that importance type of rating, and then go through, and importantly, let's agree who the owners of those actions needs to be. Yeah, because I think too often people will put down the fact that such and such needs to happen, but they forget to assign ownership for something, and they forget about the follow-up that's needed in order to make sure that you're closing those problems down. And then, of course, as you go into remediate those changes, you're going through a little mini design, build, and test phase all of its own to make sure that, and Adil talked about how that testing process can be modeled and simulated within SafePass, which is a really useful tool to have. And then finally, then you've got to roll it out. And if you're rolling it out, then there's probably some change and maybe some additional training that's needed to explain to people why the new controls have been put in place and why they need to do things slightly differently. So there's each problem that's identified needs almost like its little mini action plan with clear ownership. And more importantly, you then need to put in place the things that are going to stop it from happening again.
Absolutely. Any final words from our panel today before we wrap up the session?
Just appreciate Brian, your insight, and we look forward to working with you.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone who's joined us today and the panel for their expert knowledge. We hope the session has proved to be valuable and that you're able to take away a strategy to implement in your own organizations so that you are prepared before your audit. If you would like to explore the health check in more details, then you have my contact information there on the screen, and I'll be happy to help. So thanks everybody for joining. Thanks to the panel, and have a great day, and we'll see you very soon.
Thanks everybody.
Guys. Thanks everybody.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.